Hello and welcome to Books from Your Therapist, a podcast where we talk to therapists and mental health practitioners about their mental health related book recommendations. By mixing book talk with mental health, we hope to open up the conversation around books your therapists may have suggested and make them more accessible.
This podcast is not a substitute for mental health care. It's for educational and entertainment purposes only. I'm Amanda Throckmorton, a marriage and family therapist in California.
And I'm Tara Kremen, and I work in the book industry. In this episode, we are talking to Ellen Turner, a marriage and family therapist, about the two books, 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman, and Sophie's World, a novel about the history of philosophy by Jostein Gaarder.
It's a great mix of new and classic titles with 30 years between the publication of these books. 4,000 Weeks talks about modern life and balancing different demands for our time, offering some practical thinking points to change your viewpoint. And Sophie's World is a novel that covers the complete history of philosophy and is a little bit of a trip, and we'll get into that in the episode.
It was a really great conversation. I love that we were able to combine the concepts of like psychology with the philosophical ideas. So excited for you guys to listen.
So on today's podcast, we have a good friend and colleague of mine, Ellen Turner. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And today we will be sort of venturing into philosophy a bit. So very excited for this conversation. And to start off, we want to get to know Ellen a little bit. So can you sort of share, like, who are you?
Yeah,
it's a good starter question.
Who are you?
Great philosophy question.
Yeah.
Right? Go right into it. Identity. As Amanda said, my name's Ellen Turner. I live in the Bay Area in Marin. I'm a therapist, and outside of my therapy work, am also a big outdoor enthusiast, love to hike, and am often out on the trails running or hiking or somewhere in between with my dog. And also am a big fan of cooking and baking and enjoying food in all its forms.
You're an MFT, a marriage and family therapist, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And so you also have a private practice in the Bay Area. Can you speak a little bit about who you work with or your modality or anything that feels like you'd like to share?
I wouldn't say I have like one particular really specific niche, but more work with a variety of clients, some teens, and then a lot of adults, both individuals and couples. Also work with different configurations of families sometimes. So really like to do the combination of both individual and relational work. As far as themes, a lot of life transitions, anxiety, depression, grief and loss, also sort of existential questions, which again will be relevant for, makes sense probably why I picked some of the books that I did today. I'm really interested in that sort of thing too, sort of existential questions about life.
And can I ask, what sort of drove you to become a therapist, or what sort of inspires you about the work?
Yeah, great question. Again, I wouldn't say there's like one particular thing, but more a general sense of I knew I wanted to, in some way, kind of work generally in health and wellness. I knew I wanted to feel like I was doing something meaningful and of service to others in some way. Again, relevant to the books today. In undergrad, I studied philosophy and psychology and a lot of kind of liberal arts, sort of human nature in different ways. And then after undergrad, went the route of studying body work and became a massage therapist. I loved the theory, but then wanted to feel kind of more embodied and literally hands-on in my work as well too. So kind of swung that way. And then where Amanda and I met was through the somatic program at CIAS. And so that was a really cool sort of discovery for me of then bringing together different interests that I have and different ways that I like to use my mind and body in a way that is sort of holistically thinking of and helping others.
Thanks for sharing and kind of delving into the somatic piece, because I didn't really share that part in our last episode. And, I think for listeners that have never heard of somatics, like, how would you describe somatics?
It's a very broad and growing field. So there's a lot of ways, kind of the way I think about it is that generally, it's a holistic view, and that way to describe it is it incorporates, mind and body in a lot of ways. What that actually looks like can really depend on the person and the therapy, but I'd say most often how it comes into my work is bringing kind of a mindfulness lens. Could be doing things like grounding exercises or mindfulness exercises, but also is just kind of a general stance of when we're thinking about ourselves, not just taking into account our thoughts or ideas, but also the wisdom of what's going on in our body, emotionally, with sensations, and really taking that seriously and seeing that as a source of wisdom.
Thank you for sharing that piece. I think somatics is kind of a hot button word right now, and I see it sort of moving into the mainstream in this way. That is really cool. And I think some people don't know exactly what it is. And so I appreciate you sharing a little bit deeper about that.
I learned a little bit. I always just thought it was like being more present in your body, I guess, or maybe that's
I mean,
a
I'd say
really
that's the
small piece.
kind of the big, that's a really good way to put it in a kind of simplified
Mm-hmm.
way, that's really what it's about, is being also a lot of like attention on the present moment experience. What's happening in the moment is what's happening in your body, and using that as a way to explore.
I'm interested to kind of dive into your book picks because of
Yeah.
the correlation between like I'm kind of interested in like how psychology works with philosophy and like with therapy and everything. I feel like the picks make a little bit more sense now that you've shared some of your background. But the first book that we're going to chat about is 4,000 Weeks: Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. So why did you choose this title?
Yeah, so it was kind of on my radar actually from a colleague who just brought it in as she was reflecting on some of the things she was getting out of it and recommended it as a title. So it was in my mind already. And then I'm part of a book group and a book club, and we meet. And because I'd heard of it, I said, "Hey, let's put this on the list to vote for," and got some votes, and so decided to read it.
Nice. And what did you find were the main takeaways that you got from the book?
A lot of takeaways. I think the things that maybe stick with me the most is overall an importance in thinking about and living your life in a way that isn't just kind of instrumental, meaning doing things for a future purpose or payoff, but actually being really connected to the meaning of the experience of the enjoyment of whatever you're doing just for that purpose, right? That it doesn't have to be that everything you're doing is to some other end, but that in and of itself, it feels meaningful. So yeah, he uses kind of the term of like instrumental for future purpose versus meaningful in and of itself. So that's kind of one big area of takeaway. Another thing too is just the general reminder of really simplifying in a lot of ways, that so often I feel like we basically try to do too much, either all at once or just in general, right? That, he really talks about, because we all have this limited amount of time, about 4,000 weeks as an estimate. that there can be a pull into just trying to fit everything in, right? And while that's a wonderful thing to want to live a really full life, it can also actually lead to, more anxiety and kind of missing out on things as they're happening if we get a little too carried away with just trying to cram it all in. So just the reminder of really, really simplifying and remembering our limitations, right? And actually even celebrating the limitations in some ways.
I thought the title was interesting because like the 4,000 weeks is obviously like the seller of like, this is all, your average lifespan is 4,000 weeks. But the point of the book was not to use every week because you only have 4,000. It was really to kind of to think about being, I guess, a bit more thoughtful with how you're spending your time. So I kind of liked a little bit of the contrast between maybe like the selling point, and then I guess as a reader, you're getting kind of the opposite out of it. Like,
right.
Yeah, I also really, I feel like this title draws people in that are maybe looking for a time management book. So it's kind of perfect in that way. Like, who is it hooking? Maybe the people that need to read this, right? Like, oh, you thought this was going to be another, how to perfect your daily routine. It's nothing like that, which I love. I love that like drew you in that way.
Yeah, I think at one point the author even uses the term that he's like a recovering productivity expert or something like that. That there is that draw of like, well, if I can just manage things in a certain way, then I can cram it all in, then I can do it all, then I can fit it all in, which one of the main points of the book is that actually you can't. You can't, and that is discouraging and disappointing and can be overwhelming. But also if you can really sit with that then kind of on the other side of that, you'll see that the few things that you can do can feel a lot more meaningful.
there was definitely some stuff that I found myself using in my work afterwards that maybe I was already doing, but I hadn't realized in such a defined way. So I was just like, oh, right, that's what he was sort of saying. Especially like the task focus of like, you can only do two things. Like you can only focus on two tasks and then move it down the list or whatever. But you mentioned this a little bit at the top, and I was wondering if you could speak. This really jumped out at me, like the section. I think it speaks to us as I'm assuming you're in the same sort of millennial age range. I like to call us old-ennials because I think we remember a time before internet, and that's like an important distinction in my opinion.
Right.
But can you talk a little bit about the concept of like existential overwhelm? Because they mention this in 4,000 Weeks, I guess, as part of the like not being able to do everything.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a huge concept, existential overwhelm, and there's a lot of ways to kind of define and understand that. But yeah, generally speaking, I understand that as sort of having concerns, anxiety, despair about, feeling overwhelmed about big questions of life, uncertainty in life, inevitability of death, and having questions about, the meaningfulness of your own life or your own identity as it fits into that. I think anytime we're sort of faced with these huge questions to which we're not going to have clear answers to at any one point, that in and of itself can feel really overwhelming, right? It can feel can lead to kind of like flooding or freezing of feeling overwhelmed with all the emotions and the fear that can come with that. And at the same time, too, I think one of at least my takeaway, one of the tenets of the book is that while that can be scary, it's also really important. And if you can kind of, not his words, but give a more of like a daily dose of some of the existential questioning and reflections, that can actually be helpful and then be less overwhelming than that sort of not considering, not thinking about things at all from an existential view, and then it all kind of hits you at once, and then you're flooded by, oh my God, I'm gonna die, and what's the meaning of my life? And
Mm.
I can't do it all, and I don't know what's gonna happen in the future, right? Obviously that can be a really overwhelming experience, but if you can learn to, sit with those questions and actually bring it in a little bit more often, that I think you can again get a lot of actually clarity and insight about, again, what's most important for you.
I always think like putting a name on it too, like even the phrase existential overwhelm, it can sometimes take the power away from when you're feeling a certain ways about something because you kind of,
Yeah.
we're honed to think like nobody else understands. I'm the only one that's feeling like this. And then to
Right.
be able to read a book that's like, no, actually, there's a name for this, and like it's like
Right.
normal to go through. I always think
Right.
that's maybe helpful.
Right. Right.
um, in the same sort of idea of like putting a name on something, another thing that jumped out at me was the concept of like a second order change, which I hadn't heard of before. So I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about what that is and how it could affect the idea of how we spend our time.
I think my understanding of like first order, second order change, first order change is more just adjusting what you're doing, and doing it a little bit more or a little bit less, but basically doing kind of the same thing. Whereas a second order change is actually having an experience, a thought, something that really fundamentally shifts kind of your worldview or how you do something. For me, the example I think of is like the Copernican revolution of moving from thinking the Earth is the center of the world and everything revolves around it, of the universe, and then everything revolves around that, to realizing, oh, actually, we revolve around the sun. So it's kind of in a similar
Mm.
way. I think you can think about that as more living from a fully sort of egocentric view of I am the center, which in some ways we all do and need to do, but I am the center of the world and everything sort of revolves around me, versus having that reason for it and perspective of the ways that actually we are part of something bigger, and that having a worldview that takes into more account all the other perspectives as well.
Yeah, I feel like it's something that once it happens to you, you realize what it is, but maybe perhaps prior to that is maybe like a little bit of a hard concept to grasp.
Mhm.
But yeah, just something that, yeah, a massive shift in your life, and you're like, oh yeah, no, no, things don't look the same anymore. Yeah, I just love that you guys have names for like absolutely everything. So the next sort of phrasing, and I think it's kind of like ties in a little bit to I mean, I'm curious about your opinion of like we talked about existential overwhelm, and then this book also mentions cosmic insignificance therapy, which I had never heard of at all before. So what are your thoughts on that? And do they tie into one another, do you think, or can they be separated?
Yeah, I looked it up because I wasn't actually sure. I think the actual term cosmic insignificance therapy was coined by the author. That was kind of his
Mhm.
Ah, okay.
term,
Mhm.
but that it actually, a lot of the tenets of it are things that all sorts of worldviews actually take into account, from ancient to modern traditions as well too. But the idea of it, how he explains it, is kind of zooming out, having a bigger picture, thinking and perspective, where you actually realize your insignificance, your relative
Mhm.
insignificance within the universe. So again, zooming out, having that bigger perspective, and then from that place, realizing that any one struggle, challenge, big emotion, thing that you're going through in the grand scheme of things is actually not that big of a deal.
Mhm.
Right? Which on the one hand, it's interesting. On the one hand, that could feel, again, overwhelming, that, oh my God, I don't matter that much. And on the other hand, can be really sort of relieving and bring some more lightheartedness or humor or acceptance or serenity even to whatever it is challenging thing that you are going through, right? Because it's a way of kind of saying, this how holding that balance of if something's really hard for you, that wow, this is hard. It matters because it matters to me. And basically it's not the end of the world, right? It's a way of taking that in, taking that sort of perspective shift to heart in a big way.
For me, it's like the importance of being able to oscillate between the two of
Mhm.
the existential overwhelm, which is centering yourself, right? Like, oh, I'm so important that these questions are so big, right? Versus like, oh, actually, the seasons are going to change without me, right? Like things are going to carry on without me. And like the ability to like move between both, because you're right, you are the center of your own universe, but you're not the center of the universe, right?
Right.
So I think it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Mary Oliver poem, Wild Geese, right? Like it's like,
Mhm.
here you are going through this big thing, and like the birds are still going to fly, like the seasons are going to
Right.
change, like time still carries on, even
Right.
while you're in your own sort of existential overwhelm. Like to your point, is like sometimes that can be very freeing, like giving it up
Mhm.
to quote unquote higher power, surrendering to the nature of things, like the world that's moving on, with or without you.
Right. Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely one way I really feel into it. And then another sort of aspect of it and point that the author made too was bringing this in terms of when you think about and have the pressures for sort of needing to live a meaningful life, right? Again,
Mm-hmm.
you can say
Mm-hmm.
that pressure of, oh my God, I only have this one life. I better make it really successful, impressive, meaningful something. So the other sort of way that the author brings this in is instead of thinking about it that way, thinking about it of, yeah, you're probably, you almost certainly aren't going to make a huge dent in the universe. You're not going to make such a ripple to, in the world that it's going to make this huge impact on the entire universe, right? That actually that's not probably going to happen. So instead of feeling this pressure of I really need to do something remarkable and meaningful and special, that instead having this sense of, oh yeah, it's not going to be what I do doesn't need to totally change everything in the world and the universe, but that actually whatever I am already doing on a daily level in my own way can have its own meaning for me and for others and for those in my community and circle and that sort of thing. But sort of switching that perspective in a way that actually can really relieve some of that pressure otherwise.
Yeah, I enjoyed the piece about, even these folks that we see making great change are going to be forgotten about in hundreds of years. Like, I think the example was like Steve Jobs, right? Like, okay, like in hundreds of years, like maybe he's a footnote in a history book or something, but like it's not going to be front of mind for folks in the future,
Or
which
even
is
like the,
interesting.
yeah, or didn't he mention people that, starting tasks that won't finish in your lifetime? There
Mm-hmm.
was like those
Mhm.
people that are tracking like the giant trees or something was an
Right.
example. Yeah, I thought that was interesting that like it doesn't really matter. You can just do your little piece towards something,
Yeah.
because otherwise
Mm-hmm.
procrastination becomes such a problem.
Which again, I think he sees from a very sort of humanistic view of it's like that is the human thing, right? We aren't gods, we are humans. And our capacities are limited, our time is limited, our impact is limited, and how do we, rather than try to avoid that or make it otherwise, to celebrate that in the ways that we can.
Has the book made you think about how you want to spend your time differently?
I think there's a lot of sort of bigger questions that that the book brings up that I'd say I tend to, ponder anyway. I think one of the things that maybe is most sort of inspiring to me recently is more of the practicing doing nothing, which is again one of the sort of takeaways of the book, which again, is the maybe different than what you think you might be getting out of it, of how to fit more in, but actually really the practice of doing nothing and being bored sometimes and tolerating that and filling your time less so that again you can really be present to what it is that you are doing. Also, again, that I think they're really can really help build patience in a way, which I think is so important and where a lot of another part of the book talks a lot about distractibility and things like that, and how much of that he describes as basically having trouble being patient and or bored, right? But that can actually be really helpful to be able to learn to do that a little bit more so that we aren't so scattered.
Yeah, you're sort of answering my next question, but there's a piece, the end of the book, which is like a little bit more of a practical workbook style. Have you sort of gone through these questions yourself? Like it's also funny too, right? Here's this book that's like, we don't need these guidelines. And then here are some a little bit, right? Like,
right.
Yeah. Have you gone through any of those questions yourself or?
Yeah, there are a few sort of takeaways that I have. One of them, which I kind of already did, but am doing a little bit more now, is I am a to-do list person. That does help me, but one sort of approach she suggests is having basically like at least two lists, and having one be, he calls it the fixed volume approach, that you can't go over a certain amount of tasks in that list. You can't just keep adding to it. You have a fixed volume. You can only do so much. You can have a backlog, but that you can't just keep adding on to it until you take something away and then you can add something in. But I like that as a general sort of approach of, again, not overwhelming yourself. I do it too, even with like physical objects or items. Sometimes it's like I have a fixed amount and I won't get another XYZ until something else has given something else away or something like that. Having that fixed volume approach. Another thing he mentions that is something I'm more aspiring to is described it as deciding in advance what to fail at. Which is a way of, I've kind of heard the expression of, deciding which balls to drop, which are rubber, which are glass, that sort of expression, that sort of thing of, again, taking into account our limitations, knowing that we're not going to be able to do everything or succeed at everything. So in some ways, how he puts it, deciding in advance what to fail at, that's one way to put it, or what we're not going to focus on, or what is not going to be complete. There's a lot of ways you could think about that, but again, that's been a helpful kind of aspiring thing for me to do. Yeah.
Right. Like we're never not going to be busy. The piece for me that stood out was like, you're never going to manage your time where you're not busy. Like we just live in a busy world at this point.
Right.
So can you prioritize the things that actually feel important, not just the other stuff? And would you say that there's any sort of trigger points in this book that if someone were reading should be aware of in terms of like any content, or did anything stand out for you around that?
I wouldn't say there's, from my recollection, too much that's really triggering per se. I mean, I will say that I think, obviously sitting with the concept of death and the finitude of life and, all of those pieces can obviously be moving, can be overwhelming, can be uncomfortable, can be challenging in some ways. But I don't think the way that it's presented is necessarily triggering per se, but something to be aware of. And again, I think one of the tenets of the book is that while that can be uncomfortable to sit with, it can be really important and rewarding and worth it to move through whatever discomfort may come with it, and use that more as kind of a meditation on life and death.
One thing that surprised me was because it's a relatively new book. It only came out in 2021. So there is pandemic mention that I'm always a little
Right.
bit about whenever there's, which is funny because I think we talked about this last time too, but whenever there's like a throwback to like the depths of lockdown, I have sometimes have a hard time reading about that time, so that could potentially be triggering.
True. No, that's a good point. That is a good point. And it is, yeah, there is something that's like, whoa, that's very close to home, right? We're talking about something that is very recent. Yeah, and very, very large in all of our lives in some way. Yeah.
I think to wrap up this book, who do you think that who is this accessible? Is it accessible to everyone? Who do you think, would be drawn to this, or do we think it's readable? And this is kind of a question for all of us, I guess, because we've all read it.
Right. I was going to say, I'm curious about both of your perspectives on that too. I feel like it's definitely fairly accessible. I think it's written to, again, a fairly wide audience. And sort of like I said, and who is this for? Maybe especially if you're already sort of drawn to bigger existential questions, things like that. Actually, I'm curious. Yeah, what do each of you think in terms of accessibility of it?
Well, because he talks about himself as like a former kind of corporate workaholic. So being like the corporate representative in this conversation, I've read a couple of like time management books for specific. So I was kind of thinking about it from a like a work perspective. And I thought it definitely is accessible to that sort of person that wants to manage their time in a better way. But I liked the philosophical questions that were coming through as part of it. Yeah, I think some of the actionable, like the takeaways that you could action them, and I could see how I could use that in my work. So yeah, I definitely think it could be. I think the title is trying to grab that demographic, perhaps. But I think it could be read by anyone that's sort of interested in thinking more about their time a little bit more, or just wanting to be a bit more productive in any aspect of your life.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I didn't feel like it was a beach read. I felt like it was something you had to really pay attention to in terms of like accessibility for folks. But I felt like there were so many little just like nuggets in there that you could just sit with for a while. So I could see someone kind of reading this at a slower pace too, and taking their time with it. And actually, same with our second book, which we'll move on to in a moment. Like, I feel like there's a lot that comes through in the second book that you could sit with for a long time. So for the second book, just to sort of remind listeners, we are having mental health practitioners choose, a mental health related book, and then any other book of their choosing, right? So it can be something that inspired them, something they read last month, something they read as a kid, right? Just to bring in another side of our therapists, right? Like, I think there's a way that therapists are seen as very clinical. And, we used to say, what we say in grad school, like therapists are human too, or, therapists are people too, right? So the second book choosing is to bring in just another side of whoever we're speaking to. And it doesn't have to really be on theme, but this episode, it really was on theme. We were venturing into philosophy. So our second book was Sophie's World, a novel about the history of philosophy by Jostein Gaarder. And Ellen, why did you choose this book?
Yeah. Again, a book club book for me. It was brought in by a friend and fellow philosophy major. It was a book that she loved, I think, earlier in life, and then wanted to reread it. And it was a first read for me more recently, but also really enjoyed it. Thought it was a fun one to bring in. And I think, just because I was thinking about the other book, this came to mind because there's,
Hmm.
again, the thematic, bringing in some of the philosophical perspective as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so this book is it's a lot of things, I think, right? It's this history of philosophy, and then there's stories within stories,
Yeah.
right? Like this book was a little bit of a trip, and
Yeah.
I listened to it, and so I was laughing my last day. I was like, I feel like I'm in this world. I feel like
Right.
I'm like
Sophie's
in
World.
this.
Right.
It was very yeah, I read the first book, but I listened to this one, and
Hmm.
I think it's I was thinking about what would have been like to actually read this book, or
Hmm.
I could see this book being something that someone would actually own and go back to and dive a little bit more into philosophers. And so yeah, this book was a trip and I enjoyed it. And this one was published in 1991, right? And sort of it remains relevant today. And is it something that you would revisit?
Yeah, I think I would like to revisit. I also listen to it audio. Again,
Mm,
that's how I take in a lot of my books these days. It is interesting because, it has been out quite some time. I wondered I think I would have loved reading this earlier in life as well
mm,
too, but
mm-hmm.
and curious what that would have been like. Loved listening to it more recently, I think sometime last year, and I could see myself returning to it again in the future, definitely.
And sort of on theme with psychology, and philosophy, how do you see these two engaging with each other? Or like, what are your thoughts on how philosophy maybe influence psychology?
I mean, it's interesting because for me, in some ways, I just kind of don't know it any other way. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there's ways in which, I sometimes in my own thoughts or in readings, there will be direct sort of correlations and connections between specific philosophical and psychotherapeutic sort of theories and techniques, right? There are ways that that comes in a specific and a direct way, but also just generally, I'd say philosophy informs my view more as a kind of a stance and a way of being curious, a
Mm,
way of just sort of questioning assumptions that we hold, getting curious about that, wondering how or why we know what we know or what we think we know, and then just wondering, could there be another way? To me, I think that's a very therapeutic sort of stance is again sort of zooming out and being curious about our experience and our assumptions and having that question like, could it be any other way? Could there be another way to look at
mm,
this? Could there be another way to experience this? And that sort of stance really can open things up for healing or growth or change.
mm. Yeah, maintaining this sort of curiosity,
Mhm.
right? Like bringing it into the psychotherapy room, maintaining that curiosity with clients,
Mhm.
recognizing like you might know a lot, but you're not the expert on everything, right? On either side,
Right.
and kind of approaching every person with a real openness to their experience in life.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
I read a lot of history books and feels like we don't learn from things, but I think with a book like Sophie's World, it definitely looking at the broader history of modern Western time, I guess, that we can change things. So it was kind of like it was kind of inspiring, and I guess that's like to the existential question. One quote that I wrote down from it that I thought was kind of grabbed me at the beginning is that because philosophy to me sometimes feels a little inaccessible, but the quote says, "Philosophy is not something you can learn, but you can learn to think philosophically." And I was
Mm.
like, "Oh, okay, so that's what
Right.
this whole book is sort of trying to tell you."
I'm so glad you brought that quote too of this is maybe getting ahead to some other sort of questions and ways of talking about it. But that I think is that really captures a lot of why I appreciated the book and why I wanted to bring it in, because I too, in undergrad, formally studying philosophy, there's pieces about it that I loved, and there were parts that, philosophy can be very self-referential. It can be very full of jargon. It can be, yeah, it can feel really inaccessible. And the reason why I was and am drawn to philosophy at the heart of it, though, was again more as not something that you take on and learn, but more of a stance in life of, again, having that open curiosity, and that at its core, I think is, something that we all have in common.
No, I agree. So it goes through like most of the history of sort of like philosophy. So which philosophical concepts speak to you the most, or I should say whose? It's a long list of men. But
Dead
who
white men,
is,
mostly.
yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Who do you sort of I guess is your favorite of the philosophers, and why?
Hard to say. I mean, I think in general, I mean, I'm sure there's some that would come to mind, but for me, it was less of like ever finding particular philosophers that I really resonated with them or their theory, and more, again, I like the practice of
Mm.
taking on and sort of trying to see things from a different point of view, and then holding all those different perspectives at once. Like that's the part that I really like, is just trying to understand and then balance and make connections with different ways of
Mm-hmm.
that people are bringing in concepts, rather than finding someone who I really think got it right. That sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, though, I mean, the types of philosophy that I was interested most in undergrad, again, makes sense to where I've gone since, of more sort of philosophy of mind, phenomenology, which is talking about, conscious experience, subjective lived reality, and also sort of existential philosophers too, which, again, big questions about meaning of life and the importance of subjectivity, my
Mm.
own experience, and how much is that shape our view of the world. And then, yeah, a bit of a tangent, but related to, again, just different ways of studying consciousness and how that is different for humans, but also like really interested in animal sort of consciousness as well too.
There was that
Yeah.
question, is a horse a lot in this book?
Right, which remind me of like what one piece that does, I really want to, I haven't read it in years, but come back to, I think of What Is It Like to Be a Bat, actually, is a something by
Mm.
Thomas Nagel, in which it is talking about, I thought about that with the horse experience of,
Mm.
again, it's how much our own subjectivity informs, our consciousness. Yeah.
I like that it humanized the philosophers too. I mean, even going back to sort of like the Aristotles and stuff, who I just assume is a marble statue. And you kind of
Mm-hmm.
do forget that you're like, that
Right.
was at one point a person that lived, and there is certain things that we know. I mean, obviously history changes stories, and they evolve, and things get added to, but it was kind of interesting to see these were people that existed at some point, and they were just doing their best and trying to learn the most.
Mhm.
So, what do you think that a reader gets the most out of a book like Sophie's World? I mean, I'm sure it's like it's a challenge, so there's sort of that's probably part of it. But what do you think that a reader would get out of it?
Yeah, this is another one where I'm curious for both of your answers. But for me, I mean, personally, I when I read it, I was just having a lot of flashbacks to college, and it was kind of a fun review and reminder
Mm.
of a lot of theories and philosophers that I, haven't who stick with me, but haven't really, directly studied or focused on in a long time. So it was just kind of like a fun intellectual review in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
But again, too, I think of as kind of an invitation, right? An
Mm.
invitation to, think openly and critically, and at different, again, it talked about, whether I would revisit this. It is the sort of thing of at different times in life, different theories will kind of grab you more or resonate with you more, or you'll have different questions about it. So I think, again, it's just an invitation for reflection and discussion. And then also this book, one of the reasons why I liked it, yes, it's this review of Western philosophy, but it also is, it's just kind of a fun, trippy,
Yeah.
meta story. I
Mhm.
won't give too much away, no spoilers, but it's pretty trippy, it gets pretty
Mhm.
meta, and it's also kind of at times kind of a page turner and a bit of a um yeah, adventure as well.
Yeah, and it did address a little bit because sometimes I find books like this so frustrating because it can be like we said, like the old dead white men's point of view, and especially looking
Mhm.
at historically, because it's like
Right.
often like the colonizers' point of view in
Yes.
Right.
philosophy.
Right.
But it actually does talk a little bit about that toward the end, which I was like
Mhm.
happy to it dives into like other ethos of like
Right.
like Eastern philosophy, like indigenous philosophy and stuff like that.
Right.
But I did
Right.
like that it was yeah, it really poked fun at itself at the end,
Mhm.
Right.
which I enjoyed because it was like
Right.
Mhm.
we're sort of in on the joke, but the author's kind of making fun of me as well as a reader. So I
Mhm.
was like, I thought it was funny.
Right. Right. And so, yeah, and some of the, again, without getting too spoilers, it does have you questioning reality of the book, right? And what's
Yeah.
going on and that sort of thing of like that in and of itself is for me the fun practice of philosophy is that sort of like, whoa, what is what is going on here? I think it's done in a really fun way.
Yeah, Amanda, what did you take away from it? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think I actually never took philosophy. And so for me, it was a sort of a really good like philosophy 101 sort of overview alongside, the story within the story, which was like brought some aliveness to it. I think, like we said, like, oh, here's this little girl, right? And like her, yeah, I don't want to give away too much, but I like how she poked like some of her questions, right? Like bringing up like these are all men, right? Like that's not true, right? Like she kind of
Mhm.
voiced the questions that I would have reading this. And so I liked it as an overview, and then I kind of appreciated the humor that was infused with the main characters.
Totally.
It was made into a film as well, which I cannot imagine. Like,
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I kind of knew that and then forgot it. I haven't seen it, but now I'm very curious. I have no idea if it's any good or not,
I don't
but
know
I
how
will.
you would tackle it because it's such a large book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, how would you narrow the focus of that? But I'm curious as well.
Yeah,
Who do you think the audience for this is? We talked maybe a little bit about what we got away from it.
right.
But who do you think it's for?
I'm curious. I don't know enough about the author and the context. I'm curious kind of who they were originally thinking it was for. I
Mm,
think it is maybe technically considered a like a young adult, but I think that's the genre maybe. I mean the character is a teen. Again, I didn't read it as a teen. I think I would have loved it as a teen, I'm guessing. But it is, I think, known for and liked by, older children and adults alike. And, I often find that's a mark of a really interesting work of art if it can
mm.
really be inspiring and interesting to a variety of, audience and ages, which I think this kind of is.
I think it would be helpful for parents too, because a lot of the book is the teen protagonist,
Mhm.
like having these conversations with her mom where her mom is like, stop thinking like that. You're like asking these questions are too big.
Mhm.
So I think I was trying to think about it as of a view of like, if I was a parent, would that be helpful of like
Mm,
how to tackle, kids like to ask a lot of, but why does it do so? Why? So
Mm.
that might be helpful.
Yeah,
mhm.
I can't imagine reading this as a teen. And like when you said that, Ellen, I'm like, I just don't think I would have had the patience for it,
Right,
if I'm honest. Like I enjoyed it as an adult, but I just
right,
cannot imagine myself at 14 being able to stick with it. I do think it's funny, right? It's like written for young adults in some ways, like young adults and adults. And I'm like, this is nothing I could have tackled at 14. And that would be the difference between you and I. And it's like, it's cool that it exists for teens that have those questions, that are at that place within their minds and their own like development and growth, right?
I think it is the sort of thing that with any book, but this would be an interesting one to see, again, that you would get different things out of it at different stages in life, I'd imagine.
Yeah, that's why I was curious. I was like, if this was something that you had read and then go back to, because it definitely seems like that type of book for sure.
Right, which it was for my friend who
Yeah.
recommended it.
Nice. So what do you think inspires you about this book?
Yeah, I think it's touches on, again, the quote that you brought in, Tara, earlier. It was something I was thinking about as well, of having philosophy, again, less as a canon of knowledge and thought, and more as a stance, a way of life, an invitation that is very accessible and practical, and more about being curious and expanding your worldview, rather than the sort of like, jargon-filled armchair elitist philosophy, that sort of view of what philosophy is, but more practical, everyday life, the questions that we all share and that none of us know, and that there isn't any sort of set progress in that, but rather an open invitation for everyone to have their own thoughts and reflections and bring their own experience to both the questions and the directions that takes you in.
I appreciate both of your picks. I have one more quote, if you guys will indulge me for a second, because the first book was the 4,000 weeks and really talking about that like short amount of time. And then this quote from Sophie's World, which I just kind of thought it was like an interesting tie together, where it says, she herself was just an ordinary person, but if she knew her historical roots, she would be a little less ordinary. She would not be living on this planet for more than a few years, but if the history of mankind was her own history, in a way, she was thousands of years old.
Well, thank you, Ellen, for sort of sparking our curiosity. And like I said, there was no sort of intended theme for this episode, but I think we went into this different realm with it. And I really enjoyed both picks and just sort of the questions that it opened for me, and I'm sure listeners that read these books as well. And so I guess I'm curious, like in closing, do you want to share sort of like, where can people find you if if people are based in California, specifically Marin County, that are looking for a therapist, like where can they find you online?
I am online and in real life. I do, but yeah, I do telehealth and in-person sessions in Larkspur, where I live and work. But also, yeah, the way the license works, also telehealth throughout California. I have a website, ellenturnertherapy.com.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing, and like I said, opening our minds and kind of tying it back to psychology as well, and like why it's important to remain curious in life. And yeah, I just appreciate you coming on.
Thanks so much. It was really fun to be here. From the moment that, Amanda, you described the idea for this podcast and the themes, I immediately thought it was such a cool idea and invitation. So appreciate being on here.
Thanks for listening to Books from Your Therapist. If you're interested in the books we talked about, we'll include links in our show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us with your own recommendations, or maybe you're a mental health practitioner who is interested in coming on to share your books yourself, you can email us at booksfromyourtherapist@gmail.com.